23rd lecture in the iShore webinar series. To those who are not familiar with iShore, it stands for Institute for Social Sciences, Humanities and Oceanic Research, which is primarily a network of scholars from Kerala working all over India and beyond the country, with a shared interest in Kerala's broader histories and cultures in the Indian Ocean world, with, of course, a transdisciplinary orientation. The Institute is recently registered as a society and aims to promote advanced studies and research in humanities and social sciences, and also to provide a platform for researchers who are interested in studying the region. It was with this webinar series that iShore has started its activities during the pandemic time. And now we are expanding our activities slowly. And today we are delighted to have Professor Ananya Jahanara Kabir talking to us on Creole, Cochin and Archipelagic memory, novels of Latin Catholic life. Professor Kabir is a professor of English literature at the King's College London, and she researches the intersection of the written text with other forms of cultural expression. And some of her earlier works were on Kashmir Valley and post-partition amnesias. And two of her earlier books basically came out of that work. The Territory of Desire, representing the Valley of Kashmir, published by University of Minnesota Press, and Permanent Black in India in 2009, and also Partitions, Post-Amnesias, 1947, 1971, and Modern South Asia, which is published by the University of Dhaka Press, as well as Women Unlimited. She has also been working on African heritage, social dance and music, and the issues of decolonization and Afro-Politan. Two co-edited books and many research articles has already been published out of this research project. And I understand that she's currently working on a book out of this project, which is entitled as Allegro Politics, Connecting on the Afro-Modern Dance Floor. She has won the prestigious Infosys Humanities Prize, awarded by the Infosys Science Foundation in 2009, and also won the Humboldt Prize in 2018 for her innovative work in humanities. And her new research projects explore further the concept of transoceanic creolisation through cultural productions across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. And that brings us to today's talk, which is a reading of a set of novels that are narrativizing the Latin Catholic life in Cochin. Dr. Rajesh James, who teaches at the Department of English, Sacred Heart College in Cochin, is our discussant today. He is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, an academic with many publications in the field of visual and literary cultures. So we welcome both the speaker and the discussant. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Kabir to make her presentation. She would speak for around 40 to 45 minutes, which will be followed by the comments of the discussant for around 10 minutes or so. And then we will have an open discussion on the paper. Thank you. Over to Professor Kabir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Varghese. Thank you to all my colleagues, all of you who have invited me from iShore's side. It's really an honor. I am not a speaker of Malayalam. I'm nevertheless taking this challenge up to speak about novels in Malayalam, thanks in no small part to the excellent translations, which have brought at least two of these novels to my notice. And may there be more, because obviously this is the only way we can often understand some of the really interesting and, path-breaking creative work going on in languages other than the ones we may be fated, destined, or able to know. In our multilingual space, this kind of work of translation is really important. So in a way, the topic I'm going to be speaking about, which is broadly to do with thinking about the efficacy or the utility of bringing theories of creolization to the space of peninsular India, it's also a kind of work of translation, theoretical translation, bringing concepts and ideas not usually associated with our part of the world, bringing them to our part of the world. And that's the kind of, and what do we have to do to those concepts to adjust them? Creolization has normally been attached to islands in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean. And now I am interested in thinking about creolization on the coastlines of India. What changes in those theories, and why do we even need to bring them to the coastlines? In this, I'm being guided by our creative producers. So the novelists I'm going to talk about today are actually in this, thinking before the theorist in presenting this kind of landscape to us, from where these theories can in fact be confirmed and also tightened up to work for our context. Let me delve into the material I have for you. Although I promised that I might talk from a group of novels, all of which have in common this geographic, rather tight and small geographic focus of the area around Fort Kochi and this terraqueous geography which surrounds it. I have, in the end, returned to two novels, both of which, again, are in English. One is, I'm sorry for I should be technically competent to reverse my video, but I don't dare to do anything to the Zoom. It's so nicely set up. Basically, this is N.S. Madhavan sir's Litanies of Dutch Battery. He's with us in the audience. Thank you for coming. And it's, a fantastic book, which must be read by everybody. And the other book is by Johny Miranda, Requiem for the Living, also another very important and interesting book. And these two books, which have been translated from the Malayalam for us, help me in giving you the readings that I'm going to give. But there are other books that can well be drawn in. For example, this is a book in English. It's called Maya by George Tundi Parambil, and he sent it to me from where he lives in Germany. And it's written in English, and it's about the figure of Kapari Muthappan that I will be speaking to in course of this paper. There's, of course, the very famous and older novel by Pondikara Rafi, Ora Pro Nobis, which is also in Malayalam, also about this figure. And I know that Dr. Rajesh James will tell us a bit more about other novels that have just come out. So we don't need to stop with the two novels that I'm reading now today for us, but I'll do that in some detail so that we can, draw out some bigger ideas. Without any further ado then, the ideas I want to focus on today are about, we can say really, there are two different visions of this coastline, the Malabar Coast, on which the area of Kochi and the historic area of Fort Kochi is located. And these two visions, they're antithetical visions. One of them comes from no other than the renowned historian of the Indian Ocean, who was born in this space and this area, K.M. Panikkar. And he, of course, well known to everybody in the audience here. In one of his magisterial works, India and the Indian Ocean, which was written in 1945, he, makes some recommendations for the hoped for post-colonial nations' geopolitical security. Because it's 1945, he's writing this. And obviously, we can see that there's going to be independence in some, sooner rather than later. And what he says is, he's like, India has too long a coastline. The coastline is 3,000 miles long, and it is going to make India insecure. Ever since the 16th century, he says, I quote, from which the Indian Ocean became a scene of struggle for the control of the sea, the future of India has been determined not on the land frontiers, but on the vast oceanic expanse that washes three sides of India. And it's this expanse that makes him nervous, so much so that in the same work, India and the Indian Ocean, he says, if a steel ring can be created around India, with air and naval bases at suitable points, and if within that area so ringed, a navy can be created strong enough to defend its home waters, then the waters vital to India's security and prosperity can be protected. So Panikkar actually wants a steel ring to be thrown around the coastline. This is a very strong image. And against this image, which is the first vision of the coastline that I'm talking about, there is another vision. And that vision comes from the author N.S. Madhavan in his novel, translated into English as Litanies of Dutch Battery. And here, for example, he says, and I quote, what the sea brought to Kochi? Ducats from Venice, velvet from Genoa, thin woolen cloth from Flanders, mirrors from Belgium, and porcelain from China. From several ports came yellow sapphire, antimony, metals such as lead and tin, vermilion, coral, glass bottles, and brandy. That's what the sea brought. What the wind brought to Kochi, stories. So we've got two different visions here. One is that which wants a steel ring around the coastline, and another is that which is talking about all the things that came through that coastline into the interior, through the wind and the water. And so both these visions are actually provoked by the same phenomenon, which is that of a coastline that is porous. There is a porosity to the Malabar coast, and it is this porosity that is feared by Panikkar on the one hand, but welcomed by Madhavan on the other. So I analyze the cultural transformations which the coastline's porosity has instigated as creolization. What is creolization? It is the result of unexpected, unpredictable encounters between different parties which are brought together in the same compacted space. For example, a space like Fort Kochi, a space like Marancheri. These are compacted spaces. And these encounters have also happened under highly asymmetrical or, fluctuating power balances. So, it's all about power, it's all about violence, and it is under these conditions that certain encounters take place, which I call creolization. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to theorize the porosity of the coastline and its consequences by examining how creolization processes in India overall, on the coastlines of India, are remembered in these two novels that I'm going to talk about today. Madhavan's Litanies of Dutch Battery and Miranda's Requiem for the Living. And both of them are set in the same area around Fort Kochi, this terraqueous geography that provokes somebody like Panikkar to fear the consequences of that porosity, but makes the authors obviously think differently about what has happened to culture because of that porosity. Now, as I alerted to you earlier, both these novels are written in Malayalam and I have read them in translation, but I've done some work, around the words that are important for me as a literary critic in these novels. And these words I'm calling Paranki words. And Paranki words are words that pertain to a community that is also called or calls itself Paranki. And this is Malayalam for what I gather, roughly speaking, kind of foreigner with European roots. And this community practices Catholicism and invests in a foundation myth which rests on its formation through Vasco da Gama's arrival on the Malabar coast, and the reshaping of this community subsequently by the Dutch victory over the Portuguese in the Malabar, and eventually in the long run by British takeover of the space. So there are different layers of interventions that have created and shaped and reshaped this community. And the words which are flowing out of this community's vocabulary and which are entering Malayalam, I call Paranki words. And these words are in the novels I'm analyzing are kind of phenomenologically linked to the porosity of the coastline. What I'm then going to argue is that by remembering a certain kind of life, a certain kind of culture that these words represent through such words, a kind of a memorialization is going on. And this work of memory, I'm calling archipelagic. So all this will unfold as I progress in my talk. But this is what I just want to signal, that what this talk is going to do is going to read these two novels, going to zoom in on some of these words and the community around these words in order to argue that a certain kind of India is being remembered from this history of creolization. And this memory works in an archipelagic fashion. We must ask ourselves, what is this India and why is it important? Okay, so first of all, then we've got to remember, going back to the steel ring, there is a kind of vision of India that is quite, majoritarian, to use to use a useful word. This kind of India is Bharat Mata. It's bounded. Sumatri Ramaswamy has done excellent work on showing us how the idea of Bharat Mata became kind of calqued onto the peninsular shape of India itself. So in this vision, Bharat Mata, Mother India, a goddess, is kind of clad in a sari. The peninsula is a lower part, and she has to be protected. This is the steel ring idea, okay? And this is one, again, notion of India, which we can call, or we can think of as a bounded notion. The coastline is a separator. And moreover, it's a separator that's got to be kept separated. It cannot be allowed to open up, because that's the sanctity of Bharat Mata that we've got to protect. But on the other, there is another vision of history and understanding of history that keeps reminding us that this was actually from the Cholas onwards, frankly speaking. This coastline was a place for, springboarding cultural encounters, moving away from across the oceans, out of India and back. So this is the framework in which we can understand the advent of the Portuguese. Beginning, of course, with Vasco da Gama's disembarkation on the Malabar Coast in 1498. And as Sanjay Subramaniam tells us in his recent book, Europe's India, I quote, "Several tens of thousands of Europeans, largely Portuguese, but also a fair sprinkling of Spaniards, Italians, Germans, Flemings, and a very small handful of French and Englishmen, basically a whole bunch of different kinds of Europeans, arrived in India via the Cape of Good Hope after the arrival of the Portuguese here. And they were followed by others, the Dutch, the Danes, more French and British. And all these Europeans came to India's coast to trade, to settle, and ultimately to govern. They were missionaries, traders, adventurers, proto-colonial administrators, even forming in places what Sanjay Subramaniam calls a Creole petty bourgeoisie. They exchanged material, embodied and intangible culture with each other, and also with locals up and down the coastline in certain hotspots, the trading posts, the forts, the comptoirs, these places that they ring-fenced and established themselves in. These were the hotspots where culture was being exchanged and also created. And this exchange and creation of culture in these hotspots is exactly what I mentioned earlier as creolization, when I said you needed a compacted space for the exchange of culture to happen, pressure cooker-like, So this is what's going on in these spaces. And these spaces actually can be therefore thought of as island-like. They're not islands because they're on the coastline, but they're behaving like islands. And they are behaving like islands, and they're also behaving like contact zones on these islands. They are spaces where new unexpected cultural forms are coming together because they are spaces for contact between different kinds of peoples. And among these formations are also communities themselves. New communities are being created. just because these new communities are being created, it doesn't mean that the work of creolization is only biological. There's also a contact zone, means different kinds of groups are in contact with each other, and culture can also move through contact, through affiliation, not just through biological reproduction. And this is the kind of world that our novels are interested in, this movement from the Creole community created through biology to a creolized culture created through contact of different kinds of groups. So I want us to think about the whole area around Fort Kochi as a network of island-like contact zones for different kinds of people. And it is the fiction that we read, such as the novels I'm talking about, that actually memorializes the formation of these Creole worlds in these contact zones through cultural encounter, through transformation. But also fiction does something else. It tells us about the marginalization of these communities in post-colonial India. So there are two processes. There's creolization and the memory of creolization. There's the past and what happens to the past in the present. And these concerns radiate out in our two novels that I'm looking at today. They radiate out from a set of group identifications that emerged during the early years following the advent of the Portuguese on the Malabar Coast. Now, since this was really where the first Europeans came and settled in kind of like, in numbers and with consistency, this was also the first stretch of Indian coastline where a community was born of mixed Indo-Portuguese descent. And this community crystallized through a proactive approach of the Portuguese as colonial rulers towards interracial unions, that actually this approach of the Portuguese towards places that they came to is common to the entire Lusophone space. So you have creolized communities in abundance wherever the Portuguese left their mark, from Capo Verde to Macau. And we can think about the space of Fort Kochi as kind of part of that larger map. In India, this attitude towards interracial unions was manifested historically towards Alfonso de Albuquerque's promulgation of the Política dos Casamentos, or the marriage policy. I must say, by the way, that all this material that I'm talking to you now, I've gained enormous information and knowledge from two PhD theses. One is Charles Dias's and the other is Renu Elizabeth Abrahams. So they've done amazing work, and a lot of the stuff I've learned, I'm really condensing and interpreting a lot of their raw materials or their primary material reading. So basically, as part of officially sanctioned strategies of collaboration and accommodation, Portuguese men entered into intimate relations with non-Portuguese women from the Malabar Coast. And there were many different kinds of non-Portuguese women. There were all kinds of local communities. Now, over time, various terms defined the titles of the PhDs. I'll put it to you in the chat, Meenakshi, when I finish, but I'll definitely do that. But Renu Elizabeth Abraham and Charles Dias, D-I-A-S, and this wonderful resource of all Indian PhD theses, which are in what is the name? There's a Sanskrit term for it. You know what I'm talking about. Everybody can find all these theses online. Thank you. Yes. Thanks. So anyway, but I'll definitely give you the references later. The terms that the Portuguese derived, but some terms started being used for these new groups. I mean, when you get married, it's obvious, it's biology again, you create children. So what are these groups going to be called? Casado was one such term. That just means Portuguese for married. So you can imagine there's a lawful union marriage that's created. There's a mestizo. Mestizo is just mixed race. So this could be any kind of, union. There's also other more mysterious words like topaz. Nobody quite knows what that is. Could be from Dubash, which is kind of, translator, interpreter in many Indic languages. But there are all these words which springing up to, tell us what this community was. And then over time, these words have become more and more Anglophone. So for example, now we talk about Latin Catholic, which pertains to the religious identity of a group as distinct. Obviously in Kerala, we have the Syrian Christians. There are many different kinds of Catholics and Christians in Kerala. So it's important to say they're Latin Catholics. But you can also talk about the language Cochin Creole, which is foregrounding the geographic space. You can talk about the Luso-Indians, which is going back to the idea of Luso being an adjective for Portuguese, and you have Eurasian, a similar compound word, and of course, finally, Anglo-Indian, which is signaling this kind of Christianized community's subsumption into a kind of most recognizable, if you like, in-between group in independent India. In other words, there is a whole, there are ways in which a very distinct identity became more and more labeled through English Anglophone terms, is my point. But cutting through these layers of different kinds of languages, words derived from either Portuguese or English, we have the term that the Malayalam novels preferentially deploy for the community created historically through this marriage policy of Albuquerque. And as Madhavan says in Dutch Battery, I quote, "Near Parangi Chapel lived the descendants of the children the Portuguese had fathered from local women. They were called Parangi, meaning Portuguese," unquote. So obviously, from this quote, we can see a certain position that Parangi occupies in Malayalam. It is attached to several nouns. That is my research. Now, as I said, I'm not a Malayalam speaker, so if anybody from all the Malayalam speakers in the audience, if you want to augment my discussion here or correct me, most welcome. But from what I can see, this word Parangi attaches itself to several nouns. For example, you can talk about Parangi Mavu, which is the graft mango tree, or the Parangi Manga, which is the grafted mango. You can talk about Parangi Mulagu, which is like the capsicum pepper. You can talk about Parangi Punnu, which is syphilis or venereal disease. So there are all kinds of ways in which Parangi becomes an adjective to describe certain kinds of pre-existing nouns in the language. And what it signifies, therefore, philologically to me, is that there's a wide-ranging transformation of the Malayalam-speaking space through the introduction of material and embodied culture by the Portuguese. Whether it is through, for example, the horticultural technique of grafting, for example, you improve mangoes types by grafting one kind of mango into another, or you have new kinds of vegetables, new kinds of peppers introduced from the Americas, or you have new kinds of viruses spread through intimate contact. But this is stuff that the Parankis bring in, and therefore the things they attach themselves to become Paranki things. So it's a connotation of European foreignness, but it becomes transformed into a sense of localization. It is itself about grafting, if you see what I mean. So there is a transformative yet adaptive capacity that the idea of Paranki carries. And this, for Madhavan in Dutch Battery, is a flag of resistance. So, for example, he says, I quote, "The British ordered that Europeans could not be called anything other than Anglo-Indian. So by the stroke of a pen, all Parangis became the children of the English. And yet the folk of Dutch Battery," the fictional island he's talking about, "the folks of Dutch Battery stuck to Parangi." So this persistence of Parangi in Malayalam somehow swerves past binaries and linearities to signal a kind of sedimentation of traces. There are lots of traces, not just the Portuguese, whose descendants are the Parankis, not just of the British, who renamed them Anglo-Indians or wanted to do so, but of the Dutch as well, who left the cannons that gave their name to the island, Dutch Battery, and which is where the Parangi people of Madhavan's novel live. Now, this word, lantan, which is the Malayalam equivalent of Dutch Battery, this is also interesting because it's derived from a Portuguese word for the Dutch, which is Hollandaise. So lantan comes from Hollandaise. By the way, even in Bengali, the word for Dutch comes from the Portuguese word for Dutch. So it's quite interesting there. Now, the Parangi word itself is derived from Arab Firangi, which of course itself in its own Crusader past denoted the Franks of Europe. So, you have a lot of shifting etymologies. There's nothing one-to-one here. And these shifted etymologies suggest that the stimulus for cultural innovation arises from a continuous relay of cultural transfer between various parties drawn together through maritime trading, including, of course, the seafaring Arabs who had created local communities well before the arrival of the Europeans on the Malabar Coast. So, oh, thank you. Parangi Mavu is a cashew tree. Thank you. Basically, but of course, the cashew tree, this is important because it also comes from outside. I mean, that's the point. Thank you for correcting which kind of tree it is. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that just as the word Parangi itself is taken from an Arab word for foreigner, we've got to understand that the creolization processes I'm interested in I don't think it's accurate to say they just were kind of started wholesale by the Portuguese. I think more and more I see that the arrival of the Europeans on the Malabar Coast was a kind of accelerator and a deflector of processes that were already in place. In other words, all kinds of influences were swirling around the Malabar Coast, and the swirling is the creolizing process into which a new impetus is injected by the arrival of the Europeans. So there are many lexical traces left by these swirled encounters, and they are, interestingly, phonetically and syntactically assimilated into Malayalam, which is already evident in the original title of Miranda's novel, which I'm going to try to say now, which is Jivi Chirikunna Varku Vendiyulla Opis. Hope it was more or less in my Bengali accent. Somehow I made it somehow apparent that there is a word in this title, which is opis, which is coming from Latin officio. Okay, so the point is that many words like opis have already gone into Malayalam and become Malayalamized through the phonetics. Only philological work or somebody who's interested in telling you this word comes from here will be able to draw out the changes, the equivalents, and so on. So there is behind the word that has been absorbed into Malayalam, there is a Latin, there's a Latin word there, officio. Just as behind Parangi, there's Firangi, and behind Firangi, there's Frank. So Requiem for the Living, this novel, Johny Miranda's novel, is full of these words. And to kind of help you along, the novel in its English translation presents a glossary of these Malayalam words. But I understand that even the original Malayalam also has this glossary. I had that checked, but again, if somebody wants to correct me, I would be delighted to be corrected. But from what I understand is that the original Malayalam and the English translation both have a glossary of words in Malayalam that come from Latin, Portuguese, or sometimes even Dutch, in order to signal to you that these words have been assimilated, but they have another history attached to them. So for example, there are words like laudata, which is, now again, I'm obviously pronouncing these words terribly wrong, but I'm interested in drawing the Latin and Portuguese, etc. words together. So there's Latin laudate, which means praise, and laudata is a word like that is in Malayalam. Devasta is from Latin devotio. Combraria is from Latin confraria, it means congregation. Kunjata, kunjato, again means sister-in-law and brother-in-law, and it's from Portuguese cuñada and cuñado. And there are so many words like this, including cozinha, which is from Portuguese cozinha or kitchen. And there are a few Dutch words in the mix too, such as susi for sister, which is from susie, which is from Dutch. And of course, the infamous kakus, which is from kakaos or lavatory. Now, all these words are, for me, Parangi words, of which Parangi itself is the best example. They not only articulate this community's life ways and habitus, what they eat, how they pray, how they go to the bathroom, but they are grafted onto Malayalam in a process of mutual transformation. So these, or in another, to go back to my starting point, they kind of signal the points of porosity in the language. The language soaks in these words. So what happens then is we're not looking at Malayalam as words that are sitting in the language, ring-fenced, popping out. They have been absorbed into the language. There's a creolized continuum in the language. And in this, on this continuum, Malayalam, different kinds of Malayalam registers shade into what once was spoken as Cochin Creole. So there are two ends of a spectrum. Though this language, Cochin Creole, is now officially extinct, it was the language spoken historically by the Parangi community. So Parangi words in Malayalam, then, for our authors, are more than what philologists would classically call loan words, which is a term from philology that suggests fossilization. A word was loaned and it sort of sits there, doesn't know whether it belongs or not. I don't like this term, though I use it all the time as a philologist. I think what we've got to see is how the words got absorbed into the language and got assimilated into the language's phonetics and syntax. And so we come to a kind of paradox. While creolization stimulates the language's capacity to enable it, innovate through all these diverse cultural influences, it also makes those words domesticated. So you cannot remember that they came from elsewhere. And so what our authors do is remind you. They reactivate that memory by, for example, putting in those glossaries. So you're told these words all came from somewhere else. Or they can be intertextual activations, like that's what happens in Litanies of Dutch Battery. What Madhavan does is he will put in some dialogues into the words' mouth of his characters who will tell you about these words. So, for example, there is a character called Raghavan Master, and I'm going to be a bit naughty here, because when we spoke, Madhavan sir told me, he didn't deny it, but I said, is Raghavan Master you? And he was like, well, so I find it interesting because Raghavan is not Parangi. He is like Madhavan, a name that suggests possibly a Hindu rather than a Catholic background. But this person is creolized. He's part of this milieu and he knows all about these words. So Raghavan Master tells the Parangis in the novel. In Dutch, kak means shit, house means house, and together you get kak house, which is shit house. That's our kakus, Malayalam for lavatory. The Dutch gave us a place to do our most private thing. This is Raghavan Master speaking in the novel. So the point is that by making Raghavan the explicator of Parangi words, Madhavan reminds his readers that language stands in for elements of a lifestyle. Language conducts this lifestyle, this habitus, from the Parangi, which is a distinct Creole community created by biology, by genetics. But this distinct habitus is conducted to a wider Malayalam-speaking community, which shares that geographical space, and they are creolized by affiliation or proximity. So then these Parangi words become like a bridge between Creole and creolized communities. So there is something paradoxical about this, because on the one hand, the words are used by someone like Raghavan to say, we were open, this is how porosity works, we were open to stories, we were open to goods and material culture. But how did this openness actually work? Through violence. So creolization always returns to the violence of the creolizing encounter. And there's a vanishing point for this double-edged process, which is smuggled into language through words. And that vanishing point is, of course, the arrival of Vasco da Gama himself. And from the perspective of the post-colonial nation, Vasco da Gama is irrelevant. He came, he went, the British came, but we are post-colonial, nothing matters anymore. But for people like the characters in Dutch Battery, he matters. As one of Madhavan's characters reminds his Parangi companions, what if Gama had never come? We would have been picking weeds out of the farms belonging to upper caste Hindus. We needed a yardstick to measure the distance we had to keep from our upper caste lords. But now, are we not living in style, munching on plantain fritters, listening to film songs, and to top everything off, sipping XXX rum? This is the advantage of having had Vasco da Gama come. He created a community that is living in style, sipping rum and munching on fritters. Now, obviously, this is ironic. There's an irony here. And this irony is that's the kind of work of fiction to tell you that on the one hand, there was an advantage, which was you got an alternative to Brahminical austerity, to caste system, to aspirations of purity, but that came packaged with violence, and that continues to be seen in the life of the Creole community today in post-colonial India. I mean, obviously, there is a bathos, a descent from the sublime to the ridiculous when you talk about Vasco da Gama's great because we are drinking rum and eating fritters here. And this element of descent from the sublime to the ridiculous is very, very apparent in Johny Miranda's work, which is extremely ruthless in presenting the Parangi community as abject, as grotesque, as impotent, as stigmatized. I mean, this is nothing about cultural capital. Rather, it's about there is a stagnation and violent milieu in which this world is unfolding in this book. Once again, these Parangi words are the instruments through which there's a self-flagellation that Miranda inflicts on the Parangi community. And the difference here, therefore, is that Johny Miranda is from the community, N.S. Madhavan, like Raghavan Master, is not. So obviously, the attitude they're bringing to this history is going to be different. For example, in Requiem for the Living, Johny Miranda shows the protagonist, Osha's father, as, you know, doing all kinds of horrible things. I mean, disrespectful things. He's kind of in the church. He's, you know, all these Latin Catholic Parangi words are used to talk about the chalice, the sacristy, the altar, all the stuff around Latin Catholic ritual in the church. And then the same words are being used, a word like esti, which is the word used to talk about the cleansing that you must do, you know, after all this. Well, basically, the protagonist is having sex without observing esti, you know. So there all this sort of stuff that is shown by Johny Miranda, you know, as somehow those words are being used to both remind you of a distinctiveness of this Creole community and how it linked up to the advent of Vasco da Gama, but this is also being mobilized to talk about the descent of the community into a state of abjection and dysfunctionality. So what is the problem with the Parangi community? Why is it dysfunctional? And I think a key problem both the novels suggest is that the historical porosity of the coastline that they are situating the novels in is incompatible today by what the post-colonial state demands. And here, I think, again, it's very interesting to note that the time frame for Madhavan's novel is the early 1950s, which is exactly when Panikkar was busying himself with the State Reorganization Committee of Nehru's. And at this time, there was an emergent axis, which is going to link the backwaters of the Malabar Coast to the landlocked capital of Delhi. And this in the novel is figured through a very interesting sort of device, which is the anti-smallpox vaccination drive that the nation state has embarked upon. So in the novel, there is somebody called Saradamma. She's local, but she's the emissary of the state because she is the person who's going to hunt down everybody in Dutch Battery and inoculate them against smallpox. And the people don't want this, but she's going to do it. And how is she going to reach everybody? Because she knows exactly how the ferries work that takes her back and forth between all the different islands and backwaters. And obviously, she's a master of the ferry timetable, so she can approach everybody with her syringe and inoculate them. But this is seen both as a good thing and a bad thing. On the one hand, because she's everywhere, bustling around, she can assist in the very complex labor process of a woman who is going to give birth to the novel's protagonist, called Jessica. So Saradamma, because she's a trained midwife and a nurse and everything, she can rescue this situation and help this child become born. And she could only do this because she knows about the ferries and she knows about how to manipulate through all the backwaters. But most of the time, the problem is that the ferries stop at night and they start in the morning, and there are long periods, therefore, in the day that the islands are isolated and not connected with each other. So actually, there is a forced insularity, which on the one hand is good, because you don't have to have, people like Saradamma wouldn't have approached you with their syringes. But on the other hand, this is not really so bad, because a child couldn't have been born otherwise. So there's a kind of duality here. I think this is, one can see this in the present context, where when I was in Kochi, a lot of people were lamenting, Madhavan sir himself, that, you know, there are too many bridges now. You know, you don't need the ferries anymore. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? This is the kind of thing that the novel makes us think about. Is it better to be connected or better to be isolated? Now, what happens is that the real problem, according to the novel, according to Dutch Battery, is actually that while somehow Saradamma managed to get the child born, history, I quote, couldn't break free of the island's confinement by water. Something has happened to history in this space. It has waterlogged the place. There are Venetian ducats, as we know, baby dragons crawling out of Chinese silk pennants, enameled inner china that belonged to Carmelite priests, chapels, whatnot. There's so many things here, but they're all somehow sedimented. They've got soaked into the porosity of that space, but that porosity is not blocked, and everything is waterlogged, and island and history cannot break free. This is what the author says. So what seems to me has happened is that material has entered the creolizing matrix of the Malabar Coast, but something is preventing it from coming out, and that creolizing spectrum is now interrupted, and there are little islands being created, which are bridgeless and not joined up. This is a problem. And this is why we need to think about, how do we reconnect? I'm going to ask, how much time do I have left now? Can somebody give me a heads up?
Maybe another 5 minutes. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So I think a good place to start thinking about the Reconnection Act, which is really an archipelagic act, is to think about figures such as the figure of Kapri Muthappan, who pops up regularly in these novels as a kind of symptom almost of the need to reconnect. I'm going to quote a passage from Miranda's Requiem for the Living here. The parish, he says, is crisscrossed by canals, and everywhere there are empty lots run over by bushes. There are still some who are afraid to step out alone after dark. In the evenings, the whole place fills with the smell of Kapiri Muthappan's boiling cassava, tapioca. Now, this is a stray comment. Unlike the novels which I talked about earlier, which I didn't have time to talk about today, which actually focus on this figure, in both Litanies of Dutch Battery and Requiem for the Living, Kapri Muthappan just appears fleetingly. But the African spirit eating cassava, a tuber first brought to the Malabar by the Portuguese from South America. This conjunction of Kapri and Kappa, emphasized by the alliteration in Malayalam, draws attention to the fact that there is an idea of a sacrifice being made. Some people, some remnants of that past were walled up, because that's what the Kapri Muthappan is. The myth is that the spirits of the African slave that the Portuguese had brought were walled up by the Portuguese when the Dutch came and took over Fort Manuel and defeated the Portuguese. And therefore the Portuguese left, but the African slaves remained walled up. This idea of being walled up, it's so strong, and it's so strongly against porosity that it makes me think that whenever the Kapri Muthappan is invoked in these novels, it is a signal to that which must be released. Kapri Muthappan must be taken out of the walls, and he must be put in the terraqueous landscape of the crisscrossing of canals that Johny Miranda places him in. In other novels, Kapri Muthappan sits on the wall of the cemetery, which is another boundary-breaking space. So in these different ways, through figures like Kapri Muthappan, I think there is a signal both of the blockage, the confinement of history, but also its hope for release through porosity. Madhavan's topography produces the fear of isolation as a condition of living on Dutch Battery, but it also suggests it need not be a permanent state. The protagonist, Jessica, continually receives messages about a broken bridge from her navel, suggesting that there was an anterior life which was marked by unbroken bridges. And there's a connection between insularity, bridgelessness, and sedimentation made in the novel's opening pages through her description of the place she lives in. Dutch Battery, the novel itself, is one of the stories that must be told to recreate those, to repair those broken bridges in a way. It is a story that releases the island's confinement by water through the birth of the storyteller, even though it's Saradamma who has forced that birth. Her birthing process is actually coordinated with the tidal movement surrounding the island. And the novel unfolds other performative genres of the Paranki community, such as the famous Chavithunatakam. No time to talk about that today, unfortunately, but running through the novel is this idea that we have to recreate a new Chavithunatakam for the present day, a post-colonial Chavithunatakam about Gandhi, for example. And, all these snatches of Chavithunatakam, Portuguese and Dutch words, Kapari Mutapan sightings, cassava on the canal edge, all these are material and embodied remnants of a creolized, ocean-facing coastal world. The demands of post-colonial nationalism were shown as antagonistic to that world. But both Madhavan and Miranda, actually say that it started a long time ago when the Dutch came and took over and destroyed the first Portuguese in settlement. So there's a violence that is shown as carrying on from the arrival of different groups themselves. And somehow through this violence, we've got to remember modes of connection and reconnection. And this is what I mean when I say that there is an archipelagicity to this memory, because that which is island-like, that which is blocked up, are also sought to be released through bridges, through canals, through channels of different kinds, and through the words that themselves are bridges, as I have said earlier. So relief from bridgelessness may be precarious, may be contingent, but the memory, even of a broken bridge, can reorganize fragments into an archipelago, and in order so that we can remember together what this fragmented and yet connected whole can be. In partial conclusion, I just want to think about what it means for, if I can get my last page. Yes. Why do archipelagos disintegrate into disconnected islands? And under what conditions can these connections be restored, and to what ends? If in these novels, prominence is given to the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, this is a period that public memory in India recalls as the first phase of post-colonial nation building. And, coming on the, heels of the trauma of partition. But this is a landed view. The view from the coastline is an archipelagic view, which brings to the reader's attention another set of transformations and changes that this period heralded. The juridical, discursive, and affective incorporation of all those enclaves, not just the history of and material culture of a place like Fort Kochi, but also Goa, Pondicherry, all these different enclaves, these were all getting integrated, in Nehruvian India during this time that the novels give prominence. So even when these enclaves had not retained separate sovereign arrangements, as on the Malabar Coast, the authors such as N.S. Madhavan are using narrative strategies to emphasize the distinctiveness of the creolized cultures associated with them. And that is really why they do not deny the fragmented nature of these Creole Indias deposited in spaces like Fort Kochi, or indeed the fictional Dutch Battery, but they say, let's find an alternative structure of connection that places sea, coastline, heartland in a non-hierarchical relation of an archipelago. And so we remember differently, hopefully to act differently. It is memory in active resistance to the majoritarian hegemonies of territorialization, continentalization, and boundedness that flourishes in the contemporary moment. Creole Kochi, then, seen from the novels that I've talked about, offers maybe an alternative mode of coexisting in and with difference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Kabir. And what a way to end that fascinating presentation with the metaphor of reconnect, the metaphor of hoping for the porosity, getting back, and of course, memory and active resistance. May I ask Rajesh, Dr. Rajesh James to come in and offer his comments to start the discussion. Yes. Rajesh, over to you.
Thank you, Wagi sir. Hi, everyone. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
So it's an honor for me to be a discussant in a substantial seminar of this kind, organized by ISHO. Thank you, Mahmood, for your invitation. And my responsibility as a discussant is really challenging when I am responding to an original and an outstanding scholar like Professor Kabir. So as a student of film and cultural studies, I'll be speaking from that particular background. I've always been inspired by the scholarship of Professor Kabir and her expertise in diverse academic field. Thank you, Professor Kabir, for this wonderful and insightful lecture. So as a discussant, my presentation has three parts. First, I'll try to summarize the core arguments of Professor Kabir. Then I'll try to situate her presentation within a larger context and see how it extends the existing scholarship in the field. And lastly, from my perspective, I wish to raise a few questions to open up the Q&A. So in her lecture, Professor Kabir was trying to explore how Kochi-based fictions become a medium or a route to imagine or to reactivate the creolisation process in Fort Kochi that was set into motion by the advent of Portuguese at the turn of 15th and 16th century. She was looking at Fort Kochi as a creolized contact zone, to quote her word, to examine how novels such as N.S. Madhavan's Litanies of Dutch Patry and Johny Miranda's Requiem for the Living depict the complex history and community dynamics of the Latin Catholics in and around Fort Kochi, using the theoretical framework of creolisation and archipelagicity. I think what distinguishes Professor Kabir's study from the existing scholarship is her use of creolisation and archipelagicity as a theoretical framework, instead of the vocabulary of syncretism or cosmopolitanism, to identify and mark the cultural porosity of the Malabar Coast that she's talking about. In short, Professor Kabir was trying to theorize the creolized Kochi through ocean, using some select sea-facing novels, right? So one of the significant points which she mentioned while analyzing the Kochi novel was this: how creolisation function or perform as a political possibility for the marginalized. So as one of the Parangi characters in Madhavan's novel reminds us that the advent of, what if Gamma had never come, right? To add to her arguments, I wish to share some of my personal experience of living in this region called Tevara, which is an island very close to Fort Kochi. So as part of my documentary filmmaking practices, I've been shooting in and around Fort Kochi for some time. And in Fort Kochi, you see a place called Veli. And those who are in Kerala know this name called Veli is not so new, because you see so many places in Kerala with the same name. So it was a public defecation area in an age where the toilets were not so common, right? So when you hear the word Veli as a place name, there is a stigma attached to it. But the Veli in Fort Kochi is called Mainath Veli, right? Mainath Veli. And when I heard about that name, I was a little bit curious. I was not very sure what does this Mainath Veli means. And I was informed by one of my documentary subject during the shooting of my new film, that the word Mainat comes from the Portuguese culture, and it means washerman. It refers to the laundry worker. So Mainat is a Portuguese word for a laundry worker. So because the washerman community there were brought there by the Portuguese and the Dutch. So a Parangi word, Mainat, is grafted onto a Malayalam word, Veli. And these days it's consciously used or reactivated, to quote Professor Kabir, by the people of that region, especially the washerman community, the Wanas community there, either to undermine the sense of shameless or stigma associated with the place, or it is also added to the place as a caste marker too. So the Wana community of Veli always foreground this colonial legacy as a form of self-assertion. So for them, this European, advent matters, just like one of the characters in Madhavan's novel says. So both novels, which Professor Kabir was talking about, represent Parankis as sort of directionless. So one of the reasons that Ananya identifies in this directionless is a fundamental incompatibility between Kochi's historic porosity to the cultural influences and the centripetal pull towards the heartland by the post-colonial nation. That's visible in the novel Dutch Battery. She was talking about the character called Sharadama. So it would be interesting to explore further the fundamental incompatibility that she's talking about. Right. If you look at the legislation process of post-colonial nation, especially when India got independence, you could see there was representatives of Anglo-Indian communities in the parliament and in the legislative assembly of Kerala, right? But we don't see any Portuguese or Parangi representation in parliament. While the Anglo-Indian community was integrated to the post-colonial nation, the Parangis were either left alone or integrated to the Latin Catholic community with a subaltern status. I think the question of caste, the question of representation, all these things matter when you talk about the fundamental incompatibility. So another point of our lecture was the myth of Kapari Muthappan. Although the cultural memory of a large African presence in Kochi was violently erased from all the official narratives, both these novels reactivate the memory of Kapari Muthappan. Not just these novels, but you see many number of novels written from the community and outside refers to this Kapari Muthappan. So the erasure of Kapari Muthappan from the official record was conscious attempt of falling up of the porosity of the place because of the fear of impurity. But both these novels deliberately reinsert the figure of Kapari Muthappan into their narrative space, perhaps to reactivate those erased memory. You see, Professor Kabir was talking about it. So such spaces in these novels become, to quote Nancy Fraser, a subaltern counterpublic in this narrative. So a later addition to this list of novelists, P.F. Matthews' Adiyala Pretham, which won Kerala Sahitya Award in 2020. So I think Matthew Churton's work have not yet been translated into English. It's a must. I think we have good translators here. So inside the caste space of Malayalam literature, only very recently the contributions of P.F. Matthews have been acknowledged. I think he needs serious critical attention. So another interesting observation that Professor Ananya made is this. So it is the aspirational Brahmanism that pictures creolization as a loss of purity. Because it feels that creolization is detrimental to the caste and religion-based boundaries. So if we read critically the ongoing conflicts in the Syrian Catholic Church in Kerala, the liturgical divide between Ernakulam Diocese or the Changanaശ്ശേരി Diocese, we can see this aspect. I'm just trying to contextualize her argument in the contemporary, the power dynamics of Kochi and Kerala. The major accusation against the Ernakulam Diocese is that they are Latinized. So I think this has got more caste implication than liturgical implications. So there's a place called Mamanyimuka in the island I'm there. So I just try to do a lexical trace. The place got its name from the Portuguese term Mamanyi, which stands for all women, right? And Mamanyi and Papanyi, right? And the Malayalam term Muka, which means junction. P. Prakash in his writings on the island in Kochi argues that historically the place called Mamanyimuk has been a place where so many Parankis lived. But there is a conscious erasure of this history of this place because this place is now dominated by the Syrian Christians. So as a result, there's a popular narrative in the region I live regarding the name of the place. So Mamani, for that narrative, is a name of a lady who is a prostitute. So why there is such a fictitious narrative is circulated even when we have enough historical facts to identify Parangi presence in this region. So this is definitely a conscious attempt to erase the creolized culture of the region, to project some Brahminic stories of origin by the dominant community there. So coming back to the history of novel writing in Kerala, there's a project of caste community identity construction going on since Indulega, the first major novel in Malayalam. Professor Dilip Menon has written extensively on this in his book called The Blindness of Insight. But Jaydeviga says, very important historian, writer, translator from Kerala, she says Miranda has no such moorings in this novel. We don't even see such motive among the Parangi writers in Kerala, right? But some of the contemporary writings from the coastal regions of Kerala, we can identify such attempts. For instance, Francis Narona's new novel, so not his new novel, but his novel called Mundan Parangi has this motive in it. So before concluding my discussion, it would be interesting to know how Professor Kabir would bring the question of caste in the context of Parangis in Kochi. So coming to Kerala context, even when we think that porosity is a necessity, caste legacies in Kerala perhaps place Parangis in a low profile because of their creolized identity. While porosity was welcomed and creolized identity seen as a possibility in Kerala, it was integrated into the hierarchy of caste. So how do you see this paradox? So with this, I thought I'm opening up the floor to the participants. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I was just giving you, trying to give some of the thoughts, responding to or listening to Professor Kabir's wonderful lecture. Thank you, organized, for the opportunity, and thank you, Kabir, for that wonderful lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. So those who have questions or comments, please feel free to raise their hands. We can let you in one by one. Also, alternatively, you can type your questions in the chat so that Professor Kabir can directly answer the question. Professor Kabir, would you like to respond to Dr. Rajesh? Yes.
Yeah, just very briefly, thank you so much. Actually, I must also thank everyone who's been there's been a ongoing conversation going on in the chat. It's really amazing. So many comments, clarifications, supplements, very grateful. And Rajesh, thank you for that lovely response. Absolutely. This is there are sometimes what is the risk of stepping out of one's immediate, space of familiarity? Obviously, Kerala, like all the regions that make up India, South Asia, very dense in its actual, the hierarchies, the different groups and subgroups, the relative relations of superiority, inferiority felt and assigned to different groups, and of course, cutting across and through the religious, configurations as well. So it's a very complex mosaic indeed. And it's quite hard for people coming from the outside to step in and understand those nuances. And this is why we cannot do our work alone. This is why I have welcomed the opportunity to have conversations with you, with our other colleagues here. I mean, I am just glad, relieved that I have some intuitions, and some broad ideas, which I've tried to zoom in through the methodology of literary close reading. But to then take them to go further and to really map it against the precise socio-political map of this and the inner world of the Malayalam speaking space. This can only be done by people who know the language. That is because I myself am a literary critic and I work with language. So I can see my limitations. And that's why, Rajesh, I've been very keen to have some kind of ongoing discussion, collaboration with you, your students. I mean, of course, our historian friends cannot be, neglected either. What I mean is we have to work together. We cannot just, this is not a single person's enterprise. When I was in Kochi, for example, in Matancheri, I noticed this interesting church, the Kunan Kurusu church, the bent cross.
Yes.
Yeah.
This immediately made me feel that this is a moment where different groups of Christians were battling against each other for who will get the upper hand in the new, like everything is in ferment and a new social, hierarchy is being created. Who's going to be on top? And this bent cross is a physical sign, of that moment. So I can see, as a reader of culture, I can see these signs, but to understand exactly what it corresponds to, one needs to know more from people who actually have an idea of those nuances. So I look forward to more conversations, in short.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have some questions. Ashley and Vinu, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
You are.
Okay, good evening, everybody. It's a great opportunity to meet, Professor Ananya ma'am. Actually, I'm a research scholar from Alliance University, Bengaluru. So I have joined here in September. So basically, Ananya ma'am's research paper, starting with this title, Rhapsodia, which focuses on Mando art of Goa. So it really motivated me to take up the art form Characterise in Kerala. I'm a Malayali. Okay, so I'm trying to learn more about it. So I have a doubt, like, ma'am, what are your thoughts about how a Creole art form will be able to express its Creole expressions considering the ongoing transition? You mentioned about the post-colonial transition it's undergoing, right? So like, it's kind of a doubt, like as a beginner in this field, I would like to know how it will be able to express its Creole expression as a cultural one, considering the transition it's facing.
Shall I quickly answer that? Then we, yeah.
Please.
So,
Please.
yeah.
Please.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy, Ashley, to hear that my paper, my article on the Goan form of Mando has provoked you to think about Chautanattakam, because that is exactly the kind of provocation or inspiration that one hopes one work lead people to, So I'm very interested in Chautanattakam as well, but it's a very complex terrain, as I've signaled. And it's also one that requires, if you're going to be doing a PhD on it, please do it, because we need people to work on these materials. The difference straight away, I would say, is that in Goa, where the caste hierarchy works very differently, Mando, as I have mentioned, is a very elite form, and it has presented itself and preserved itself in an elite space. So the way it is working as a creolized cultural product is quite different from the way Chautanattakam has formed and is being presented today. Because had I had the time, we would have talked a little bit more about it being associated with the Parangi community, with a kind of degenerated and marginalized Latin Catholic kind of side of life, which also the recent fantastic photos by K.R. Sunil, which I used one off on the flyer, very poignantly express. They are vulnerable from different perspectives, including climate change, which is what his photos were showing. So I would say that no form, but it is a living form. Now, this is the interesting thing. It is not yet fossilized, and that ability of it to live in a precarious state and somehow still function is, I think, very important. We must see culture as not folklorized before the fact. Let's not put it into a showcase before it has to enter one. It is still, and this is also the case with practices like the Bhanpathar in Kashmir. Pankaj Joshi Kumar made a fantastic film on it. So all kinds of performative traditions in our post-colonial nation state that are competing with each other for resources, with Bollywood, with whatnot, even if they have to take the state's patronage to survive, they will do it because it has to. So I urge you to look at a practice like Chauta Natakam on the one hand as creolized, because that gives us a straight line into thinking about a particular history of its formation and an assessment of its status, but to bring it back to the post-colonial, kind of this bazaar that we are in, which is the nation, who has the ability to present themselves and survive. That is really what we have to see in the present moment, and it will change from region to region, state to state, because the state center relation is the most important one in the post-colonial nation, I think, for resources and for self-presentation. If tomorrow if Mani Ratnam takes Chauta Natakam and makes a film of it, already the film Charlie used it, but it didn't do it in a way that could project it further into the mindsets of people. Who knows? Maybe something is waiting for the people of Gotruth. Keep tabs on that. But let's keep in touch. I would love to know more about your work.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, Professor Meenakshi Menon, would you like to come in? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Ananya, thank you for a really brilliant talk. I absolutely enjoyed it. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it, because I was raised in Tripontra in Fort Kochi, so to speak. So some of the things you described were my quotidian as a child. Now, I want to tell you something that I hope you'll pursue. I mean, it's a detail of personal biography that I don't usually talk about. I'm a member of the Cochin royal family. My great-grandfather was the Abdicatidam Valyamran, and my grandfather was Iron Menon, the educationalist. So I grew up inside the confines of the royal family and its associated lineage groups. And the one thing I can certainly tell you about this is the greatest fear among the lineages that constitute the family was creolization, right? This is the daily terror that accentuated purity, pollution, binaries in a way that completely traumatized a small child like me, because I could not understand why, for instance, there was a Muslim Ummah who used to work in the grounds of my grandmother's house. And she was never let into the house because that would violate the purity of the house, right? So one terrible memory I have from my childhood is I used to love Ummah. So I would go and hug Ummah first thing in the morning. And if my mother or my aunt caught me, I'd be immediately bathed. I mean, I'd have already had my morning bath, but I'd be given a second bath. And if you want to understand how we lived in this bubble, there's my great-grandfather wrote an autobiography. He learned English just to write his autobiography. And then my grandfather wrote a biography of my great-grandfather. You can get it from the Kerala State Archives. They've published it. It's called The Rajarishi of Cochin.
Okay, so thank you so much.
Get it and read it if you want to know how traumatic it is growing up in such a caste-intensified space,
That's really quite moving in a way. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm again quite humbled and honored that my theorizations are actually hooks for people to kind of what was going on in our life. Because we all, I think, wherever we were placed, we had versions of that, and this is why I call my antithesis to creolization aspirational Brahminism, because it's not just about being a Brahmin from a Hindu community. All of us who are in this Indic space, whether, I'm from a Muslim family, Rajesh has been speaking from his own perspective, and he's not from a Hindu family either. But we understand the structure because we are part of it. And this is an aspiration on the part of everybody to go up rather than down, So this hierarchy is embedded in us. Modes of behavior we want to emulate so that we can get further and further away from that which we are all afraid of. And this is something that all of us, in our own ways, hopefully many of us are trying to, redo or rethink, reenact. And sometimes we are converging as a result. So I'm certainly going to look at going to track down the biography. And I think what you said will resonate with a lot of us. It certainly does with me. Thank you.
Look, if it's out of print, just
I will be in touch.
I'll send you a photocopy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Meenakshi. Dr. Sam Kocheri, would you like to come in, please?
Hi, Professor Kabir. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I loved it. I'm from Fort Kochi. I'm a Latin Catholic myself, but I'm not a Parangi. So there is a vast distinction between these two. And so when you focused on many of the things of Parangi, and it's a small part of Latin community, which I'm part of. And again, we have 3 different castes in itself, in Latin Catholic community itself, which makes it very complicated because each caste inside Latin Catholics have different vocabularies. And, from coastal place to inland, the vocabularies change. So, it would be wonderful for you to look into that if you're very much interested in that area. And also, when you say Latin Catholics, that is a term that based on, not on language, it's based on the Christian rite that we follow. But right now we are trying to go back to Roman Catholic thing, because it is kind of appropriated by Syrian Catholics themselves by saying the Roman Catholics are higher caste, Latin Catholics are lower caste. So, which is not absolutely true, because everybody is Roman Catholics, but then what we follow is Roman rite, which is true. But Syrian Syrian Catholics follow Syrian rite. So we are trying very hard to reconquer our term as Roman Catholics, by renaming everything, by saying not Latin Catholic diocese, but then Roman Catholic diocese of Cochin, which I belong to. So, so that dichotomy is very, I think, in the current terms would be very much interesting for you to why that also. And also the vocabularies that could be involved in carpentry, because many of the carpentry vocabularies like Katala, Miranda, Jahanara, all these are Portuguese words, which because my great-grandfather was again a part of the royal kingdom of Cochin. He was involved in carpentry shops in the royal family of Cochin. So my grandfather was a carpenter himself. My father quit the job and he into something else. So these are the areas that I think in manual labor, things would be much more creolized, I feel like. So you might find some massive amount of glossary of words involved.
Fantastic. Yeah. What about boat building? What about the boat building?
I really don't know. It's about boat building. No clue about it. But then my family was basically building almaras, coats, chairs, and that sort of thing.
Unbelievable. This is a great resource. Thank you so much, because I had never thought about, of course, we know about the Janelas. They're very famous. Janlas in Bengali but apart from and we know about bits and pieces, but the idea that this is a lexical field is actually really interesting, and I'm going to definitely follow it up. The other quick thing I'll say quickly is, because I know that so many people are, I'm just, there's quite a few people still wanting to ask questions. I have personally found extremely confusing this whole terrain between all the subdivisions of different kinds of Catholics. I'm seeing them in a way as so that we can look at it in two ways, apart from needing to know what they are. I mean, I need a workshop or something in Kerala to kind of, somebody has to show me, I have to make my tables and my notebooks. Apart from that, though, what is the outsider able to say is the significance of this proliferation of subcategories? And as you say, this anxiety to kind of show, again, this is a symptom of that islanding. We need to protect, we need to keep everything, since we are all mixed up, but now let's make sure that we are quite clear about what kind of mixed up we are. So, that reflex of aspirational Brahmanism is going on. Yeah. At the same time, from the outsider's researchers' perspective, they are all versions of a creolized community, if you see what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And I like this word Parangi because it's almost like nestled at the core. It's like ground zero, the Big Bang. It's like the starting point. And from there, all these other possibilities are mushroomed, and different subdivisions have been made to maintain this caste-like, structure, as you yourself put in your words. So on the one hand, they have to be mastered, by the researcher. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think it's important to understand, what is it a symptom of? What sort of structure is this all about? Yes. So that's how I would interpret it. But certainly fascinating and important, info for me, which... And,
I would like to also add about the Kunan Kurisha, which you visited.
Yes.
It's very funny that there is one old cross which is there in Matanjeri, and maybe kilometers apart, there is another church built by the Orthodox Church of Kerala, saying that is the original Kunan Kurisha. so there is a bit of fight over the original location. We are the original authors of this Kunan Kurisha. And also, Kunan Kurisha is also known as Prandan Kurisha. Prandan Kuriyachan. Prandan Kuriyachan means the Kuriyachan who is mad. But actually, it is a creolized form of Pirande Cruce, the cross on the street. Pirande Cruce, it transformed into Malayalam and changed to Prandan Kuriyachan. So it's not it's not as Prandan Kuriyachan. Some of the people still say it. So it's an interesting field. You'll find a lot of things.
Thank you for that. Again, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Our writer of Litanies of Dutch batteries here, Ms. Madhavan sir, would you like to come in for a comment? Perhaps I was particularly interested in the kind of linguistic exchange, that fortified Malayalam that you're speaking about. On the one hand, it actually stimulated the language, but at the same time, the language domesticated many of these words that actually comes from the Creole background. So I was just wondering, and love to hear from Ms. Madhavan sir, how he has ethnographically and linguistically recovered, some of these words coming from the, Parangi and Latin Catholic community. And of course, if he has any specific responses to whatever you said, he's most welcome to interview. And Ms. Madhavan sir, over to you.
Maybe sir doesn't want to come.
Okay.
I don't know. But he's sort of, we can see him there. But
yeah. Okay, then in that case, we can.
Maybe he's talking but unable to unmute. I don't know.
Oh, he's unable to unmute?
Oh.
I don't know. Just curious.
Madhavan sir, please unmute yourself and speak.
Maybe we can also come back to him later.
Yeah.
But perhaps we can try our luck later, a bit later.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a question from Sonia Lucy. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Ma'am?
Sonia?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So it's not a question actually. I just wanted to, give a bit of information which I had about this creolized words which is used in Kochi. So I'm a person from Kochi, and there's a place called Saudi in Kochi, people usually think Saudi is a place which resonates Saudi Arabia, but it's not like that. From what I read, this place gets its name from this church called the Our Lady of Health, which was built by the Portuguese in 1500s. And health refers to, or the Portuguese word for health is Saudi, S-A-U-D-E. And the place got its name from that particular church, the name of the church, Saudi. So I just wanted to inform you, or just give a information, a bit of information which I had about creolized name of the place. Thank you.
That's really helpful. Thank you. It's reminding me also of this place in Pondicherry called Samba Covil, and people think it's something to do with samba or something, but actually it's to do with Sao Paulo. It's like Saint Paul. So it's the same sort of thing that there are some words that this is what I was talking to about when I said they get kind of absorbed into the language and actually lose all referentiality and start even being given another etymology, according to whatever is current at that moment. At the moment, Saudi, is on everyone's mind because it's a place of migration. So why not? So thank you. Thanks for that. It's very important. Interesting. I think there was a question from Grace.
Yes. Grace Raju, please unmute yourself and come in.
Hi.
Yeah.
Good evening, Professor Kabir.
Hi.
Hi. I'm a research scholar at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. So my question is about this word creolization, because I recently read your article on creolization that came in Comparative Literature Journal. Yeah. So I was just wondering that we all know the etymological origin of this word and how it came, and it was circulated. But I was just wondering, do we have such enunciations from this subcontinent, South Asia, or are we? I mean, how do we translate creolization into a South Asian lingua or into a South Asian language? How do we understand creolization from a South Asian linguistic perspective? If you could answer that.
Sure. I'll also refer to another article of mine that's come out in the last few months in the Post-Colonial Literary Inquiry, PLI journal. It's on open access as well. And there I make a lot of, I actually go through a lot of the history of the word, the term creolization. There's a connection to the term Creole. Okay, so the point is there are communities which may call themselves anything, including some version of the word Creole, which is coming from a Latin word anyway. And there is a process, which is a scholarly tool or a theory, and we are calling that creolization. But the question, therefore, is, can we use this term, the theory, to talk about places where the communities may not have any etymological connection? That word. So, for example, the word Creole first came about in Cape Verde. Like, if you think about it, like historically, because that was the first Creole society ever created in this way, during European modernization, a European power went and started settling a place that was completely uninhabited. They brought African people there, blah, blah, etc. So Cape Verde was the first place this happened. And Cape Verde, the Cape Verdean Creole language, was the first Creole language in that sense that emerged. And it has its own word. It's called itself Creole. Soon thereafter, the same words cognate started appearing in the Caribbean. And in my article, I trace all that. Now, the point, therefore, is that can we, if we shift to the Indian coast, Are there such words? And if they are not, then do we, basically is our possibility, is our ability to use theories of creolization in case dependent on or not dependent on or connected to whether a word like Creole and its cognate exists in India or not. So there are two ways to answer it. Firstly, actually such words do exist. So you've read my article on in comparative literature, and actually that's using Pondicherry to show that in Pondicherry, there is a group that calls itself Creole. In fact, two groups. They call themselves High Creoles and Low Creoles. That word Creole in French, Creole, is actually used. So, like there is such a word. But for me, it's more important to note that there is a word called Parangi. I said that's my ground zero. For me, that's the first Creole community of India. And they give themselves a name. It was an emic name. And that name, it doesn't have to be called Creole, but it is an equivalent of it. And so it enables me to use the theory. So it is convenient that a word like Creole is there in our Indic space, thanks to Pondicherry. But that convenience is by the by. The process happened, it left communities that gave themselves certain names that recognize their distinctiveness through such naming. Now, if you shift to Southeast Asia, the earliest discussions around creolization as a linguistic process happened through scholars of the Dutch communities in Southeast Asia, in places like Java. They didn't use the word Creole either, because Creole is a Latinate word, and the Dutch are speaking a Germanic language. So they were using other words, they were calling themselves nigger, Deutsch, or whatever. Like, the thing is that people were using words that were descriptive words for themselves. One of those words have escaped and become part of a scholarly apparatus. Let us distinguish between the two and not prevent us from using this term to look at academically, analytically at processes. Nevertheless, it is interesting to note that in India, this word also exists. So
because I mean, it was quite evident in your article as well, this Pondicherry anecdote that you mentioned. But, my question also comes from this location of the Hindi heartland, because you see, when you move to the peninsular region, even if we don't outrightly use the term creolization, the process is understood. It is people have already understood. They have a knowledge about this. They are aware of this process. But when you move to the hinterlands, let's say for the Hindi heartland, then it's a challenge. How do we translate this process? Because you see here, the movement is, whatever you see, the movement is from the north, from the upper region. So how do you bring in this peninsular, and how do you translate this process? And that's precisely where the divide lies in understanding the process of colonialism. That it is not just conquest as it is understood, but it is much beyond, it's much more than the conquest. Do you see that my question?
Yes. So now I think we need to think about a moving map of creolization. And that's why the idea of archipelago and fragments is important for me. I would never claim that all of India got creolized. It's not even historically valid, and neither is it in a way necessary. But can we deny that in the middle of UP, people are speaking of almaras, or they are using words like pao, or whatever. We cannot deny that words and vocabulary have traveled, as indeed have lifeways. So we have to trace, as scholars or analyzers, we have to look at pathways and processes. How did this process happen? I am convinced, I argue that the starting points may have been these hotspots on the coastline, but there was a capillary action through which these cultural formations moved selectively, or even narrowly, but they moved through certain capillary-like forms into the heartland and created a web. Okay, now this is also important for us to think about decolonial processes, de-Brahmanicizing processes. We cannot say that we are going to start a revolution. We are scholars, but the revolution is already there. People have the resources in them. Culture is spread out. We need to track and see where is the pathways. So historically or socioculturally, one pathway for has always been rivers. Even on the coastline of Africa, people have seen that creolization processes move from the coastline up rivers into the heartlands. Okay. Similarly, we can look at rivers, riverine networks, and imaginatively novels such as, for example, Tejo Tungabhadra, which I liked very much, again was translated recently, is exactly doing that. It's showing how these rivers like Tungabhadra are imaginatively fusing with the river Tejo in Portugal to create a new geography, imaginative geography of possibilities. So this is a work of the imagination, but of course, rivers like the Hooghly were precisely these conduits, because in Bengal, the enclaves we are interested in happened on the Hooghly. They were not on the Sundarbans is another geography, It's not going to permit that kind of creolized settlement, though, even though we had some like Lucy Bari and these words again. Lucy is Lucy is a British name. Bari is house. So you have little settlements in places like in Sundarbans even, which have these. But we are talking about these enclaves which are happening on the formed on the Hooghly River, So rivers are forming. In the course of the 19th century and with the British taking over, I think the railways performed that route. So then that the railway colonies of the Anglo-Indians become these ways, in which the capillary action works. So in other words, we've got to think about how could this culture have moved into the heartland. And the heartland already is eating biscuits, lots of biscuits, which are, and cakes. These are culinary evidences. The Christmas cakes of Allahabad, it's as heartland as you can get, but it's also as creolized as you can get. So how did it get there? So we've got to track the processes, but it cannot be uniform. And we don't want a uniformity, because then we're back in hegemony. We're not talking about a Creole majoritarianism. That is not even philosophically possible.
Ophira, I'm sure you have something to ask on the language and the mixing of language, etc. Perhaps.
Well, actually, John and I are thinking to invite Ananya here, and I don't want to take more time. And she's in UK, and we are in Glasgow, so it shouldn't be too onerous to invite you here and have a lecture and a dinner with a good discussion. I have lots of reservations as usual, but I shouldn't be a troublemaker. It was really interesting. Thank you. And yeah, we both enjoyed it. But John has a question, so I let him ask.
It's rather a big question. Big subject, but it was just that both the novels have explicit references to liturgy, Litanies, Requiem, and I was just thinking about the role that liturgy itself might explicitly have a role as a context, as a bridge between cultures and also a vehicle for memory.
Yes, liturgy is really, really important, and that is a kind of even connector or common ground between, say, a very high caste, elite casteist product like the Mando from Goa, and the kind of deliberately self-abasing kind of text that we are looking at from, like, say, the Requiem for the Living. Sorry, is what happened? I hope
someone unmuted.
Yeah. Yeah. So liturgy is for me, it's religion is always both a dividing force and a connecting force, so rites and rituals are a way, it's in a language again, which people use to kind of also say this is what we are, and this is making us distinct, but it also connecting me or us with other groups like us elsewhere on the coast. So I'm very into liturgy, and I think that it's no accident that liturgical words come in, but the register is important, because of course they are kind of ecclesiastical and they're Latinate, whereas other words like kakus or whatever, they're more demotic. So there's a bit of both is what I was trying to point out. as far as work goes, of course, I am just waiting to meet you and have a conversation, because for me, I have yet to work out. I mean, I know I would like to think a little bit more about Matancherry and its connection with Fort Kochi. There are different communities with different kinds of creolizing or non-creolizing, in sort of histories. How do they connect up? So there's a lot I have to talk about with you and refine my ideas through that conversation. So let's do it.
Maybe I'll just have a small comment here, and maybe Mahmoud can come in here, because I think that if we start from the 16th century, it kind of missed a little bit that these creolization processes that you're talking about were building on networking strategies that already existed in the Indian Ocean ring, especially in the coastal areas. And also, I'm not so sure that the hinterland was not something that was, maintained pure or whatever, right? Because I think those contacts and engagements, etc. So kind of put creolization, and that's also after hearing what Meenakshi said, to kind of contrast the creolization with some kind of purity obsession. I'm not sure it works. I think it should be problematized a little bit. And again, the whole idea of mafila, right, it builds on this kind of, if you want, biological, but also linguistic and also cultural creolization, if you like. I'm not sure I buy into the term, but let's go with what you're talking about. So it existed already before. And is there really a pure culture? Are Brahmins, say in Kerala, are something pure, or upper caste are pure? Or maybe if we start really digging into history, we have all those types of linguistic and cultural contacts, like, well, you have Sanskrit words in the Malayalam language that behaves just like, what happens to Portuguese or Arabic in the Malayalam language. So maybe that's the normal thing,
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that's why.
No, again, I couldn't agree more with you. And that's exactly why at some point, I was really saying that let's think about swirls or, things that exist, which are then accelerated, or there's a new impetus, and there's, it's not, I really am so against the idea of privileging any kind of origin narrative, that I would really like to see how we can always, we can think maybe of watershed moments, but we cannot say that things started ab initio at some point, particularly in a place like Kerala. So, and for me as a literary scholar, I'm also interested in representation and what people are presenting. So it's the Vasco da Gama moment is presented by an author talking about a community. So, many layers of representation here. It's really about what is memorialized, what is considered as, let's put it as a starting point. It need not be the starting point. There need not be any starting point, but how do people, what structure are people putting on their memories, I think is really what I'm getting at. And in that case, of course, there were, nothing is pure, but it's about how are you presenting yourself, and what are you anxious about, and why are you anxious about something? So I think these questions, which are very important, of course, at the current juncture, just get thrown into sharper relief, perhaps by the new conversations we are having, but the materials are not new, and the processes are not new, and neither is the scholarship, like people have been working on these things. I'm just trying to bring another way of looking at it. But certainly I'm very curious to see how these pre-existing structures that you're talking about actually interact with the new forces. And that's certainly something that's why I'm eager to actually have this long conversation with you and get started on thinking about that. So thanks a lot.
Okay. I don't think that Ms. Madhavan is with us now. I think given up. Maybe you can respond to that question, because since you have interacted with both the authors, how ethnographically, since both of them, one from the community and one from outside the community, how difficult this process of recovering these words. That's one. The second thing that I wanted to ask is, of course, this general discussions about Kerala's exceptionalism basically speaks a lot about its community orientations and the so-called cosmopolitan life it has, not only just along the coast but also even otherwise. And even Ashish Nandi's piece on the non-Euro centric cosmopolitanism in Kerala actually speaks about certain communities, particularly, I mean, the Syrian Christians, the Jewish tradition, the Arab Muslims, etc. So, and then also we have this, I mean, invisibility of the communities that you are actually speaking about, today. And then you have also the contemporary reality of what you have been telling towards the end of your presentation. Their, I mean, reduction to objection and dysfunction, right? So I was just wondering, apart from the question of purity and caste, etc., are there any other kind of reasons, like say, for instance, other influences coming from other geographic locations, say, for instance, their connection with Southeast Asia? Would that kind of things are also be factored in the larger history of this marginalization, right? Yeah.
I'll just quickly try to cover the points now. Obviously, again, I cannot, I wish we could have had the author speak to the language issue, but I did ask Madhavan sir about quite a few questions about his use of language when I was lucky enough to meet him in Kerala, so in Kochi. So based on that conversation, I think basically so I asked him, as a non-Malayalam speaker reading in English, the novel, could he explain to me a little bit about the kinds of, the different varieties of Malayalam he was using for his different characters, and indeed what kind of Malayalam the narrator was also using. And he confirmed, hopefully I've got the information right, and we can ask him to reconfirm when you catch him somewhere physically, but the confirmation really was that yes, the narrating voice, is that of a kind of upper caste Malayalam, is how he put it, as an upper caste Hindu person would speak, is the way he put it. And in fact, that led me to ask about the Raghavan figure, who is also speaking that same Malayalam, and which he, as I said, smiled, mysteriously when I said, is that actually a figure of him, the author himself? So he said to me also how he had been attracted to Fort Kochi as a person, and he had kind of been gravitated to Fort Kochi in the course of his life, and he had learned. So this is what I consider a process, again, of affiliation. He is not in any way a product of the biological creation of new communities in this region, but neither is anybody autochthonous or original in that way. He has consciously brought himself into that geographic space to absorb more, And then the product of all that is this novel, which interestingly enough, he wrote while he was in Bihar, when he was posted there. So as far away from Kerala as you can imagine. So I found all that quite fascinating. This novel is definitely being used by him to showcase the spectrum of creolization that has entered to make Malayalam a very variegated language. And he's kind of pushing parts of it out there and receding parts of it, depending on the characters that are in play, the narratorial voice he wants to project, and so on and so forth. So I think that people who can read Malayalam, this should definitely be a good research topic for them to really see how this is working. So that's the thing. Now, I have not had the benefit of speaking to Johny Miranda about his writing and his work, but the tone is so different. It's so satirical and it's so self-flagellating as a community, as I said, that I think it would be politically, I can't imagine Madhavan sir, as not belonging to the community, taking that on himself. He is rather commenting, he's manipulating that community to say something about even possibly where someone like him is coming from. You see, whereas Johny Miranda is using it to talk about their own community from within. There's a self-identification between novel, narrator, material, and author, and that allows him to do things that obviously Madhavan sir may not want to do or feel able to do, So that is a distinction we must make. And now there were several other questions that you also said, which I've forgotten. Can you remind me of?
Maybe we can taken it up later.
No, I'm sure they were very important.
It is perhaps we are getting late as well. So if there are no other,
I think did Dr. Menon have her hand up?
Dr. Menon, do you have anything else to add quickly? Yeah. Yes.
Very quickly, Ananya, when you do this, as you continue your research, please pay close attention to upper caste resistance to language creolization. I mean, I'm a kind of living embodiment of that, because ever since I was little, all I would ever hear is adu parayanda, ada acharu vaakalla. So pay attention to all the attempts to enclose Malayalam within a certain kind of bubble and resist words coming into the language.
I think that's really important. And again, in the novel, in Dutch Battery, this character of Chinna Thambi Alavi, who is credited as starting the first, the whole genre of Chavuthu. It's made very clear in the novel that this person is writing a Tamil, Malayalam kind of, it's all mixed up, So there, whenever he can, I think Madhavan sir is inserting some sort of alerts that language is never pure, even nothing is authentic, everything is always mixed up. And I think that's his mode, perhaps, again, of resisting that which you are saying it's a counter resistance to the resistance of upper caste Malayalam speakers to keep that language ring fenced. He instead is using the novel to point out all the places and all the ways it is totally not, and this porosity, therefore, that I was talking about. But thank you again.
Before we end, Dr. Rajesh, would you like to add or supplement anything at the end? I mean,
No, sir. Yeah.
okay, thank you so much. In that case, we shall conclude here. Mahmood, would you like to come in and propose a vote of thanks and a concluding remark? Yes.
Sure. Now, there are a lot of things to say, but this was so superb. And I really enjoyed listening to the lecture, definitely the paper, as well as the discussion by Rajesh and all the members from the audience, or many members from the audience. And I think we can go on talking about these nuances of these issues, because we had a very brilliant paper. And that of course, generates a lot of comments and discussion. Extremely grateful to Professor Ananya, Jahanara, Kabir for being with us and giving us such a wonderful paper. And for almost 2 hours, you have been talking more or less continuously. And also to Dr. Rajesh James for being a very good discussant and inviting us to the nuances within the paper, as well as the broader context. And also to each and every one of you, those who raised questions, those who stayed with us from the beginning till the end. And I think formally I'll end this session here. But just before you all sign out, we'll have the next session on June 16th. Stay tuned to our website or our platform. We'll announce them later. But for now, just mark the calendars. Once again, thank you so much for everyone. And also to our president plus chair plus discussant, Dr. Vijay Varghese as well. I should have said this earlier, but then thank you so much. And good night, good evening, wherever you are, until the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. All of your
Thank you, Professor
welcoming
Kabir.
presence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.